Three struggling actors, barely scraping by in a cramped New York City apartment. They're eating canned beans for dinner, taking on humiliating day jobs, and being rejected at auditions day after day. Their names? Gene Hackman, Dustin Hoffman, and Robert Duvall. Three men who would become legends, living together when nobody in Hollywood wanted them. But there was something about Gene Hackman that his closest friends witnessed behind closed doors. Something that Robert Duvall, now at 95 years old, has finally decided to reveal. And what he's sharing will completely change how you see one of Hollywood's greatest actors. You see, when Robert Duvall speaks about Gene Hackman today, there's a weight in his voice that wasn't there before. These weren't just colleagues who happened to share an apartment. These were brothers forged in the furnace of rejection, men who saw each other at their absolute lowest before either of them had a dollar to their name. And after decades of keeping certain memories private, Duvall is now pulling back the curtain on the Gene Hackman that the world never really knew. The tormented artist, the fiercely independent soul, the man who carried wounds so deep that even his greatest successes couldn't heal them. Let me take you back to where it all began. The year is 1956, and California's Pasadena Playhouse is buzzing with young actors desperate to make it. Among them are two men who couldn't be more different on the surface. Robert Duvall, born into a military family with connections to Confederate General Robert E. Lee himself, carries himself with a certain quiet confidence. Then there's Gene Hackman, a former Marine from Danville, Illinois, rough around the edges, with a chip on his shoulder the size of the Hollywood sign. When their paths first crossed at the Pasadena Playhouse, neither could have predicted they'd be sharing not just stages, but the intimate struggles of pursuing an impossible dream. Hackman's background reads like something out of a Steinbeck novel. His father abandoned the family when Gene was just 13 years old, driving away with nothing more than a casual wave goodbye. Imagine being that kid, watching the taillights disappear, knowing your father chose to leave. That kind of abandonment doesn't just hurt, it fundamentally shapes who you become. Gene carried that wound into every room he entered, into every relationship he tried to build, into every character he would eventually play. Robert Duvall saw it from the very beginning. He was a tormented guy, Duvall would later admit, always into his own space, his own thing. But here's what makes their story so remarkable. Hackman wasn't just wounded. He was also brilliant. Even back at the Pasadena Playhouse, before any of them had proven themselves, there was something about the way Hackman approached his craft. While other students were trying to be pretty or charming, Hackman was digging into something raw and real. The problem was, Hollywood in the 1950s wasn't ready for raw and real. They wanted leading men who looked like they stepped out of a cologne advertisement. Gene Hackman, with his aquiline nose and that face that looked like it had lived a few too many hard years, didn't fit the mold. The rejection came swiftly and brutally. Gene Hackman was actually asked to leave the Pasadena Playhouse after just 3 months. 3 months. The instructors told him he had no future in acting. Can you imagine being told you're not good enough for a program designed for beginners? But here's where you see the first glimpse of what Duvall came to respect and fear about his friend. Gene Hackman didn't quit. He didn't slink home to Illinois with his tail between his legs. No, he doubled down. He packed his bags and moved to New York City, determined to prove everyone wrong. Duvall was making the same pilgrimage to New York around the same time, and soon enough, their paths would cross again. New York in the early 1960s was a brutal place for young actors. This was before the romantic comedy version of Struggling Artist became a thing. We're talking about genuine poverty, about wondering whether you'd make rent, about taking jobs that crushed your soul just to keep the dream alive. Gene Hackman worked as a doorman. He moved furniture. He did whatever it took, and Duvall was right there beside him, taking on his own degrading day jobs. Then Dustin Hoffman entered the picture. Another reject from the Hollywood machine, Hoffman connected with Hackman at the Pasadena Playhouse, and the two formed a bond over their shared status as least likely to succeed. When Hoffman made his way to New York, it made sense that these three outsiders would orbit each other. Eventually, through a combination of necessity and genuine friendship, they decided to become roommates. The stories from that apartment have become legendary in Hollywood circles. But what Robert Duvall is sharing now goes deeper than the fun anecdotes about scrounging for auditions. Living with Gene Hackman was not easy. Duvall has been careful with his words over the years, but now, with the perspective of 9.5 decades of life, he's being more honest. Gene was intense. When he was in one of his moods, which was often, the entire atmosphere of the apartment would shift. He'd disappear into himself for days, barely speaking, radiating this energy that kept everyone at arm's length. Duvall recalls moments when he and Hoffman would exchange glances, both of them knowing to just give Gene space. You didn't push Gene Hackman when he didn't want to be pushed. But here's the paradox that Duvall now emphasizes. That same intensity, that same darkness that made Gene difficult to live with, was exactly what made him great. When Gene Hackman finally started getting roles in theater productions, audiences couldn't look away. There was something dangerous about him, something unpredictable. While other actors were performing, Gene Hackman was excavating. He was bringing parts of himself to the stage that most people work their entire lives to keep hidden. The breakthrough came slowly, painfully slowly for all three roommates. They were supporting each other through failures, celebrating the tiny victories, a callback here, a small role there. Duvall remembers the fierce competition mixed with genuine love. They wanted success for each other, but they were also acutely aware that in Hollywood, there often aren't enough seats at the table. Gene's first film role came in 1961, a tiny part in Mad Dog Call. Nothing special, but it was something. Duvall got his own break soon after with To Kill a Mockingbird in 1962, playing the mysterious Boo Radley. Finally, things were beginning to move. But Gene's big moment took longer. He was in his 40s before he got the role that would change everything. Buck Barrow in Bonnie and Clyde in 1967. Think about that. 40 years old, more than a decade of scraping by, and only then does Hollywood finally recognize what Robert Duvall had known all along. That Gene Hackman was something special. The Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor followed, and suddenly the man nobody wanted was one of the hottest actors in America. What happened next is where Duvall's recent revelations become particularly poignant. Success didn't heal Gene Hackman. If anything, it complicated things. Duvall watched his friend navigate newfound fame, and what he saw troubled him. Gene didn't trust it. He couldn't. When you've been rejected as many times as Gene had been, when you've been told you're not good enough over and over, success feels like a trick, like something that could be yanked away at any moment. So Gene worked. He worked obsessively, taking role after role, as if stopping for even a moment might cause the whole illusion to collapse. The 1970s became Gene Hackman's decade. The French Connection, in 1971, won him his first Oscar for Best Actor. His performance as Detective Jimmy Popeye Doyle was raw, aggressive, and utterly magnetic. Then came The Conversation in 1974, where Francis Ford Coppola cast him alongside Robert Duvall. This is significant because it was one of the few times the two friends worked together on screen, and Duvall got to witness up close what Gene had become as an actor. He was better than ever, more controlled, but still carrying that dangerous edge. But Duvall also saw the toll it was taking. Gene was exhausted, hollowed out by the constant demand to access those dark places within himself. Duvall has spoken carefully about Gene's work ethic over the years, often praising it publicly. But now he's adding context that changes the narrative. It wasn't just dedication, it was compulsion. Gene Hackman couldn't stop because stopping meant confronting everything he'd been running from. The abandonment, the rejection, the years of being told he wasn't enough. Acting gave him a place to put all that pain, to transform it into something audiences would pay to watch. But the cost was his peace. Hollywood loved Gene Hackman because he could play anything. Villains, heroes, complicated men who existed in the gray areas. Gene disappeared into all of them. Mississippi Burning, Unforgiven, The Royal Tenenbaums, Enemy of the State, an incredible body of work spanning decades. Directors fought to work with him. But behind the scenes, there were whispers. Gene could be difficult. He had a temper. He didn't suffer fools gladly. Duvall now contextualizes these stories with compassion. Yes, Gene could be tough to work with. But that came from the same place as his greatness, an unwillingness to compromise, a refusal to do anything halfway. Bill Murray once described working with Gene Hackman on The Royal Tenenbaums as challenging. Gene was particular, demanding, and not always warm on set. But Murray also noted that when the cameras rolled, Gene delivered something you couldn't get from anyone else. That was the trade-off. You got genius, but genius came wrapped in complexity and sometimes conflict. Robert Duvall, having known Gene longer than almost anyone in Hollywood, carries a unique burden. He watched his friend's entire journey, from those days of sharing canned dinners in a cramped apartment to both of them becoming respected legends of cinema. Duvall himself accumulated an extraordinary filmography: The Godfather, Apocalypse Now, The Great Santini, Tender Mercies, for which he won an Oscar. In many ways, Duvall's career was smoother, less tortured than Gene's. And Duvall is acutely aware of that difference. There's a particular interview where Duvall was asked if he was still friends with Gene Hackman, and his response was telling. "No, I am not saying we're not friends, but I haven't talked to him in a number of years." The sadness in that statement is palpable. These weren't just casual acquaintances. They were men who had been forged together in the absolute worst circumstances, who had seen each other before the world knew their names. So what happened? Why did that friendship fade? Duvall is now suggesting that Gene's retreat from the world wasn't sudden. It was gradual and inevitable. Gene Hackman retired from acting in 2004 after filming Welcome to Mooseport, though he never officially announced it. He just stopped. At 74, he walked away from an industry that had finally embraced him and moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, with his wife Betsy Arakawa. He chose isolation, quiet privacy. For someone who had spent decades revealing himself on screen, maybe it was the only way to finally have something of himself left. Duvall understands this on a level that most people can't. He knows that Gene didn't retire because he was tired of acting. He retired because he had given everything he had. There was nothing left to excavate. The well was dry. And unlike Duvall, who has continued to take selected roles well into his 90s, Gene needed complete separation. It was survival. But here's what Robert Duvall wants people to understand now, at 95, looking back on a lifetime that intersected with one of cinema's most complex figures. Gene Hackman was a genius. Full stop. Not in spite of his demons, but partly because of them. The same abandonment that wounded him as a child became the fuel for performances that will live forever. The same intensity that made him difficult to live with made him impossible to ignore on screen. Duvall also wants to complicate the narrative. It's easy to romanticize the tortured artist, to think that pain automatically translates to great art. But Duvall lived with Gene Hackman. He saw that the pain was real, often debilitating, and not something Gene would have chosen. If Gene could have been at peace and still been a great actor, he would have taken that deal in a heartbeat. The suffering wasn't a strategy, it was a burden. There's also this. Duvall now admits that he, Hoffman, and all of Gene's close friends carry a certain guilt. They saw the signs. They knew Gene was struggling, not just with external obstacles, but with internal ones. And in the competitive, individualistic world of Hollywood, everyone is so focused on their own survival that it's easy to let friendships slip, to lose track of someone even when you care about them deeply. Duvall hadn't spoken to Gene in years not because of any falling out, but because life happened. Careers happened. Distance happened. When Gene Hackman essentially vanished from public life, retreating to New Mexico and rarely being seen or photographed, the industry respected his choice. But Duvall wonders now if that respect was also a kind of neglect. Should someone have pushed harder to stay connected? Should someone have made sure Gene wasn't just alone, but actually okay? These questions haunt Duvall, especially as he himself navigates the twilight of his own legendary career. At 95, Duvall has achieved everything an actor could dream of, yet his thoughts often return to that cramped New York apartment, to those three young men who had nothing but each other and a shared, desperate dream. Dustin Hoffman went on to become one of the most celebrated actors of his generation. Duvall himself is regarded as one of the finest actors alive. And Gene Hackman created a body of work that stands toe-to-toe with anyone in the history of cinema. But Duvall's revelation isn't just about celebrating Gene's achievements. It's about acknowledging the cost. It's about saying out loud what many in Hollywood know but rarely discuss, that the industry takes. It takes youth, it takes mental health, it takes relationships, and sometimes it takes so much that even massive success can't fill the hole that's left. Gene Hackman gave audiences performances that will be studied and admired for generations. Jimmy Popeye Doyle. Harry Call from The Conversation. Little Bill Daggett in Unforgiven. These aren't just characters, they're studies in human complexity, brought to life by a man who understood darkness intimately. Every time Gene tapped into rage, betrayal, or isolation on screen, he was drawing from a real well. And Robert Duvall wants the world to know that was costly beyond measure. There's another layer to Duvall's reflections that's important. He's also celebrating what Gene represented for actors who didn't fit the mold. In an era dominated by traditionally handsome leading men, Gene Hackman proved that talent, authenticity, and raw power could triumph over conventional good looks. He opened doors for generations of character actors who would have been shut out otherwise. His success said, "You don't have to be pretty. You have to be real." Duvall sees his own career as part of that same lineage. Neither he nor Hackman were ever going to be mistaken for matinee idols, and both of them turned that into a strength. They brought gravitas, believability, and depth to every role. They made you feel like you were watching real people navigate real situations, not movie stars playing dress-up. But beyond the professional legacy, Duvall keeps returning to the personal. To the Gene Hackman who would laugh at some stupid joke in their shared apartment. To the Gene who would rage against the unfairness of the industry. To the Gene who, even when things got hard between them, remained fundamentally important to Duvall's understanding of himself and his craft. Duvall recently said something in an interview that cuts to the heart of all this. "Gene was a big part of my life as a young actor in New York City. I have a lot of great memories from those times. It's hard losing such a long-time great friend. It's easy loving all the memories that were created from the long years together." That phrasing, "it's hard losing such a long-time great friend," is ambiguous. Is it lost through distance? Through the passage of time? Or is Duvall preparing for an inevitable loss that comes with age and mortality? Whatever the specific meaning, the emotional truth is clear. Robert Duvall is reckoning with what Gene Hackman meant to his life, and he's doing it publicly because he wants the world to reckon with it too. He wants people to understand that behind every great performance was a human being carrying weight most of us can't imagine. He wants Gene Hackman's story to be told honestly, not as a Hollywood fairy tale, but as the complicated, painful, beautiful truth. In Duvall's recent reflections, there's also a warning for younger actors coming up in the industry. The lesson isn't suffer for your art. The lesson is, protect yourself. Build real relationships. Don't let ambition consume everything. Because the industry will take as much as you're willing to give, and it won't stop when you've given too much. It'll just move on to the next person. Gene Hackman somehow survived. He made it to the other side, retired on his own terms, and found a life away from the cameras. That's more than many in his position can say. But Duvall's point is that it shouldn't have been that hard. The system that chewed up Gene Hackman for years before finally recognizing his genius is the same system that continues to operate today, and that should trouble us. As Duvall looks back on nearly a century of life, much of it spent in the crazy, beautiful, brutal world of acting, he sees Gene Hackman as emblematic of something essential. The best actors aren't technicians, they're explorers of human experience. They go to places within themselves that are uncomfortable, sometimes dangerous, and they bring back truth. Gene did that better than almost anyone. But the cost was isolation, exhaustion, and eventually, the need to disappear entirely. Robert Duvall's final gift to his old friend is this: telling the truth. Not a sanitized, feel-good version where struggle leads to triumph and everyone lives happily ever after. But the real, complicated, deeply human truth. That Gene Hackman was brilliant. That he was difficult. That he was wounded in ways that never fully healed. That he gave everything to his craft. And that even decades later, people who truly knew him still carry the weight of that knowledge. In Hollywood, we love comeback stories, redemption arcs, and happy endings. But some stories don't fit that mold. Gene Hackman's story is one of extraordinary achievement built on a foundation of pain. It's a story of 3 struggling actors in a cramped apartment, 2 of whom have stayed relatively public and connected, and 1 who had to walk away to survive. It's a story about the invisible cost of art, the price of excavating your own trauma for public consumption, and what it means to truly know someone before the world knew them. Robert Duvall, at 95, knows he doesn't have unlimited time left to tell these stories. And so he's choosing now to speak more openly about Gene Hackman, not to betray confidences, but to honor the fullness of who his friend was. To insist that we see Gene not just as the sum of his performances, but as the complicated, brilliant, tormented man who created them. The truth Robert Duvall is revealing isn't a scandal. It's not a revelation that diminishes Gene Hackman in any way. It's the opposite. It's an insistence that we see the human being, with all his struggles and complexities, and that we recognize the incredible courage it took for that human being to give what he gave. Gene Hackman, wherever he is now in his private life in Santa Fe, probably wouldn't want this attention. He spent 20 years avoiding it. But Robert Duvall knows that some stories need to be told, not for the person at the center of them, but for everyone else. For every young actor who's been told they're not good enough. For every person carrying wounds from childhood that haven't healed. For every artist wondering if the cost of their craft is too high. Gene Hackman's story says, you can make it. You can survive. You can create something extraordinary. But it also says it might break you. It might take everything. And even when you succeed beyond anyone's wildest dreams, the scars remain. Robert Duvall and Gene Hackman shared more than an apartment in New York. They shared a dream when dreaming was all they had. They shared poverty, rejection, tiny victories, and eventually massive success. But through all of it, they shared something more fundamental, an understanding that acting, real acting, costs you something. And some people pay that price more dearly than others. At 95, Robert Duvall is making peace with his own legacy while honoring the legacy of the men who walked beside him. His revelations about Gene Hackman aren't an expose. They're an elegy. They're a love letter to a complicated friendship and a complicated man. They're a reminder that behind every performance we admire, there's a human story we may never fully understand. Gene Hackman gave us gifts that will outlive all of us. Every time someone watches The French Connection or Unforgiven or any of his dozens of remarkable performances, they're watching Gene excavate parts of the human experience that most people keep buried. That's the magic and the tragedy of what he did. And Robert Duvall, who was there from the beginning, who saw it all, wants to make sure that when we remember Gene Hackman, we remember the whole truth. The genius and the pain. The triumphs and the cost. The man who proved that you don't need to fit the mold to be great, but who also showed us that breaking the mold can break you. That's what Robert Duvall, at 95, has finally revealed about Gene Hackman. Not a secret, but a truth. Not gossip, but love. Not an ending, but an honest reckoning with what it means to create art, to chase impossible dreams, and to pay the price that greatness demands.